This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
What about all these other models? The old toolkit, does it still hold value? Are there models out there that we're underutilizing or not utilizing in a way that could be more effective, that may also get us away from the subsidy that everyone continues to talk about within the employment model? And maybe, if done right and deployed in a meaningful way that attracts physicians and gets them into a meaningful discussion.
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host, Trevor DaRin. Today we're going to talk physician alignment. My colleague, Brian Esser, led this research from Ryota, Terada. He and I worked together on this research, so I'll be jumping in with some insights as well. This is the evergreen perennial topic. It's something every health system is working on all the time. Why did we choose to do a big research deep dive now?
We knocked this one out of the park on the research side. And it was enjoyable because it took me back to when I started consulting. Physician alignment 10, 15, 20 years ago was the hot topic. How do we align with our physicians? The debate was around typically specialists, but primary care was creeping in as we saw the advent of the ACA and push towards value-based care. Back in the days, the alignment toolkit of co-managements and PSAs and CINs was evolving and shaping, and employment was clearly in the mix, but not the dominant form that we see today. Take it forward to 2025, and employment is the default model of alignment as pursued in the market today, with well over 2/3 of physicians falling into an employed model, be it with a provider, health system provider, and or a disruptor, or a payvider, or you name it. The options are wider than they may have been, but employment seems to be the default that most organizations are tending towards. What about all these other models? The old toolkit, does it still hold value? Are there models out there that we're underutilizing or not utilizing in a way that could be more effective, that may also get us away from the subsidy that everyone continues to talk about within the employment model? And maybe, if done right and deployed in a meaningful way that attracts physicians and gets them into a meaningful discussion, can we compete with the offerings from private equity or venture capital or the payers in a way that puts hospitals at least on similar footing, if not the same footing, or at least shows that, hey, we're willing to flex and innovate within alignment going forward? So that was the percolating of the idea.
We bundled our three takeaways in buckets of ideas, and we talked employment a lot. The model that we ended up hearing the most about from members and that we probably are pushing them the most to continue thinking strategically about is clinically integrated networks. The idea of how to use equity as a piece, either with employed or aligned physicians. Going into this research, I thought this was the place we were going to hear the most new opinions and the biggest shift in perspective from members. Because we had heard over the last 18 months-ish, people would bubble up. I got it in front of a big crowd from a CEO. Like, why should we even think about employing primary care physicians if this data you're showing us about leakage has just been so persistently hard to move the needle on, and there's so much leakage out of my system, and everyone has a lot of visibility into the subsidy per physician and how hard it is to track and account for downstream. The fact that we were getting these questions all the time, I was waiting for the health system that said, we're deprioritizing employment, or that they were even thinking about moving away from their legacy employed group. And in no way did we hear that from any health system. It could also be that a couple of things changed in the last year or so. And I think the biggest one, I'll be interested if you agree, is the fear of physicians moving in big groups really quickly to a disruptor of a payvider. The glean came off that option. And we're even hearing members talk about they're waiting for physicians who moved over, who have now been there a couple of years, to say, this isn't what I signed up for. I wasn't even one of the partner physicians making the decision. I know what being employed by a health system looks like, and I'm going to move back to that model. We've heard more than one health system talk about that as they've already picked up physicians that way and they expect to pick up more. The lack of momentum from a bunch of the disruptors. You could put Walmart in that bucket, where we've had to talk about this is going to impact demand for physicians because the scale of their ambition could impact the supply of physicians. And then others like the growth of Village MD, the growth of Oak Street. I wouldn't say they all stalled universally. They all have a different story, but the lack of continued growth there, the lack of that is looking like this super attractive option where you have a way smaller panel of patients and your work-life balance looks totally different. Largely that's swung back. There's still plenty of physicians moving into more of like a concierge model. There's still a lot of options out there, but the lack of how good those alternatives looks makes employment look better. We heard from members plenty that more younger physicians are thinking that makes the most sense for the work-life balance that they're expecting. Going a more entrepreneurial route just doesn't match those expectations. Was there another factor that flipped that and made employment look so much more attractive in the last year, 18 months that you guys heard?
With the younger generation, hearing about their interest in employment, that's not a new trend. It's something that we've seen over last decades really, looking at different survey data depending on which type of physician census you're using. This is one where I'm still trying to find something more than just opinion articles around some data rooted on it. The difficulty for transitioning to private practice when you're mid-career, when you have no experience in private practice because you went straight to employment, and most of your network, the folks that you're colleagues with, those that you run into conferences with, also were employed, makes it more challenging to make that jump to private practice. For those that do, enter with a perspective that it gives them a toolkit to ask the right questions, right? It's not just about, is it the right practice, the right skills? Is it the right people, the right partners you're going to be joining? Navigating the culture fit, things that you didn't have to think through as much before under play models, makes it that much more challenging. It's like a compounding issue where as we see that shift to employment, we've long passed that inflection point where it's easier to follow that inertia towards employment. Having that directionally shift requires something that can overcome that, which doesn't mean it can't happen. We've seen, at least on the financial side, a lot of opportunity for some specialties. Orthopedics, of course, comes to mind. We've all talked about it so much for the last decade, following the ability to shift a lot of those joints to ASCs and whatnot. I do wonder, what else do we need to be able to overcome that inertia going forward?
The only other thought on equity, and it's not around why, but it's about how we're suggesting systems think about and measure the impact and measure the subsidy differently. We heard some measuring it in the very traditional way. Here's the costs we've allocated to that practice, and then how much ultimately we pay in salary to each provider. The more advanced systems, when they look downstream, talk about all the diagnostics that come out of that practice because they're no longer attributed directly to the revenue from the practice, as well as all the other revenue generating procedures and pieces. When you layer those pieces together, we have a pretty simple visual in the final report. It tips the scales and it makes it look less like a subsidy and more like a driver of revenue. Only a half or a third of health systems are looking at it today.
And that's the part where it's interesting, where there's that understanding of downstream capture, whether it's ancillaries, admissions. None of what the health system does is possible without the physicians. When we consider whether it's anti-kickback or Stark laws, we have to be very, very careful how we navigate that territory, which makes it even more difficult of understanding what's an investment versus a subsidy. What is that math? We're not lawyers here, so we won't give you legal counsel on how to navigate that. But we acknowledge that's another wrinkle that's made it more challenging to navigate what compensation level is appropriate for employment versus when do we think about different models to align to achieve the goals that we're trying to further as a system.
Ryota, you're not a lawyer? I thought maybe you picked that up along the way.
He plays one on TV.
Let's talk more about clinically integrated networks, CINs. Most health systems reported they're using it, but huge distribution in terms of those that felt like it was actually achieving some goals and those that felt like it was outdated. What do we learn and what are we pushing systems to do different?
We surveyed a bunch of strategy teams across the country, and roughly 50% said they had or currently are sitting on a clinically integrated network in some way. The infrastructure is there. It has a tax ID number. Whether they're using it optimally is the question. My experience coming out of the consulting world was we built a CIN, opened the tent, and said, hey, physicians in the market, we want you to join our network. Come on in. Everyone's invited. So one big tent approach seemed right at the time. What we didn't realize was that the commitment to the goals of clinically integrated network, focus on quality and cost and the AAA were understood, but maybe not as high priority for every physician that we led into the network. So over time, there was a clear variation in commitment and performance. The issue then becomes it's hard to exit physicians from the network once they're in. It's just hard to hold physicians accountable within these settings. You have these CINs where you have a small cadre of very committed physicians who are pushing hard, typically primary care, maybe the medical specialist, hospitalists, et cetera. And then others that may not be as vested because it just doesn't impact their day-to-day as much. And so we have this variation, who's driving the ship, and ultimately, did the payers in your market keep up or not? If it never really came to the point that contracts infuse shared savings or other financial opportunities through the CIN dynamic in pursuit of value or other risk arrangements, did it make sense long term? So some of these networks are muted at best in where they have gone and how they're performing, whereas others we're seeing very advanced, operating, have downside and upside, even capitated type risk environments, inclusive of employed and independent physicians, primary care and specialty. And there's a long history of pushing the clinical envelope in pursuit of quality, costs, all of that triple aim idea. So that's where we're at today. The network itself is probably the best chassis to infuse those independents that are remaining in your market into your collective clinical pushes across all the service lines in any setting. And if used appropriately, is it an environment that can also be attractive as an alternative to private equity or venture capital type push? The dollars probably won't align, but that feeling of culture, camaraderie, advancing a clinical system in a meaningful way can be fostered and built within a network. We've had a few calls from both the adult side, but even more so on the children's side as of late. Children's hospitals saying we need to expand our geographic reach and we can't employ all these pediatric physicians across the region or the state. They're independent, they want to be. And so they're also looking at CINs and others tools as being that vehicle to bring these groups together. It's one of those of it's nice to have. It's a well understood legal model. We talked to one lawyer, a real lawyer, not just Ryota, and his argument said a lot of these CINs were built for issues or to solve issues that we didn't even need CINs for. How do you leverage the safe harbors and other inherent legal protections there in a meaningful way that is comfortable across the entire system, but also shows some kind of return or value add for those independent practices?
Ryota, talk about how systems are thinking a little differently about the use of equity in driving physician alignment. We've heard about it for a long time from the other side, that competitors and private equity had so much more flexibility there. We're seeing health systems get more creative and think about how to use equity. Your background in ortho, you've seen this for a long time.
From private equity side, we've seen a few of the PE-back efforts fizzle out of late, but from the health system side, this has been a conversation that, while it comes up a lot, they've been relatively slow. There weren't as many systems that are proactive about it, or rather, even when they were, the politics behind it were so unwieldy. Usually it was an unfortunate mix of the systems willing to take this on were the larger scale systems, which made it even more difficult to figure out what are going to be the guardrails or the rules. That's been several years since we've seen that burst of energy. There's, from the ASC side, a little bit more maturity on when is an appropriate time to think through which groups do we target for approaching with equity. It's an investment because you're trying to grow together for new markets, or maybe it's a defensive move because otherwise this group's going to go elsewhere. Versus thinking about more novel ideas, spinning out specific service lines or part medical groups. It's been considered by multiple systems we talked to. We had the discussion about compensation earlier. Do not confuse that with equity. We're not lawyers, but we've talked to some that tell us be very careful. Equity should not be treated as compensation. It should really be investment side. This is one where those that are going to be involved in those models are contributing. For example, if it's an ASC, it usually has to be surgeons that you're going into partnership with, and there's caps on how much they can take out versus they put in from their work side. Thinking through those dynamics, we're in a more mature state than we were before, but a lot of maybe the renewed opportunities for health systems is actually more of a reflection of retreat or cooling down of interest from the private equity or venture capital side. What's top of mind now? It's not necessarily healthcare. It's AI everything. Thinking about where the dollars go, it could be AI in healthcare, but they might not be as excited about the fact that orthopods can bring joints to ASC. That's giving an opportunity for health systems to reevaluate what is the price they're willing to invest in versus reacting to a little bit of a heated up market that we were facing a few years ago.
What's one signal you're looking at or paying attention to? It's not a trend yet, but you're keeping your finger on the pulse because it's going to impact this landscape. I get to go first because it's my show. Early in our research, one of the groups we interviewed said this longtime player in their market had pointed to in case studies as this great example of what a well-aligned independent group could do. They were leaders in value-based care. The call started with, well, they're just going to become part of our health system now because that generation of providers who had led their identity was getting close to retirement. And the next generation of leadership wasn't as committed to the same principles, focus, way they spent their time and energy. We already know a pattern across the physician landscape, but it's something that if that happens to a few other of these big, powerful, independent groups across the country in the primary care side, and if that continues to be decisions around health system employment versus a couple of years ago, it looked like those decisions might be more around alternative sources of employment, something to keep paying attention to. Brian, Ryota, signals that you guys are looking for.
I'm looking at what may be challenging health systems from an existential point of view of their business model. While we talked about physician subsidy or how we calculate that is justified a lot from the downstream. And yet there's so much interest in and energy in taking parts of that equation outside of a traditional health system, whether it's from payviders, disruptors, or the scale that some of the physician groups have achieved, the ones that are still remaining independent. What would happen if we were seeing policy shifts or some other shift that tilted the scale in their favor instead of having health system that owns the entire continuum to being delegated to just the high acuity? I wonder if we'll see that come to fruition.
I was looking at it or thinking about it from the physician side, especially the independents out there. Those that are left standing, I don't know if they're all of significant size as far as numbers per se. They're fairly sophisticated. You have to assume they've embedded and were able to overcome EMR mandates and getting the data in the clinic and attracting talent and recruiting and supply escalation, all of which they haven't really seen a huge uptick in physician fee schedule rates over the last several years, if not longer. So they've been able to survive this long. So they're probably some of the jewels around the markets that these are the groups that you want. They're probably high end, highly accountable to themselves, highly productive. And if they come knocking and say, we can't sustain this pace right now that we're going today, but we're not ready for employment, what is your counter? And is it attractive enough? Is it competitive enough? I would be ready for those discussions. They're coming and we just need to be ready. I think that's the next wave of physician discussions and alignment that's going to happen.
Thanks, gentlemen. It was wonderful doing this research with you, as always, and thanks for sharing your perspectives here with our listeners. Talk to you again soon.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks, Trevor.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and/or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at Sg2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, Sg2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You could find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.